The rain was relentless that evening, the kind that soaks through every layer of clothing, leaving a chill that refuses to fade. Ethan Blake, the self-made real estate mogul, sat in the back seat of his black SUV, watching the droplets race down the window as his driver navigated through the dark streets of downtown Seattle. It had been a long day, full of meetings, negotiations, and the usual pressures of his billion-dollar empire. His mind was elsewhere, on projects, investments, when suddenly the car came to a halt. "Sir," his driver, Max, spoke cautiously, "there's someone on the road." Ethan looked up, squinting through the rain-soaked window. There, in the glow of the headlights, stood a woman. She was drenched, her long hair plastered to her face, her clothes clinging to her body. She looked fragile, broken, and lost. Ethan hesitated. He wasn't the type to stop for strangers. His life was too complicated for that. But something about her, maybe the emptiness in her eyes or the way she stood there, unflinching in the storm, made him act. "Pull over," he instructed. Max obeyed, pulling the car to the side of the road. Ethan stepped out, his umbrella doing little to shield him from the downpour as he approached her. "Miss," he called out over the rain, "do you need help?" The woman didn't respond at first. She just stood there, staring at him with wide, vacant eyes, as if she couldn't comprehend his words. Slowly, she blinked, her lips parting as if to say something, but no sound came. "Are you hurt?" Ethan pressed, stepping closer, his concern growing. This time, she shook her head, but it was clear that something was terribly wrong. She was trembling, her eyes darting around as if she was trying to make sense of where she was, who she was. "I don't know," she finally whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. "I don't know who I am." Ethan's chest tightened at the sound of her words. Amnesia? Panic flashed across her face as she swayed, her legs giving out beneath her. Without thinking, Ethan caught her just before she hit the ground. "Easy," he murmured, supporting her weight. "Let's get you out of this rain." He led her to the car, where Max opened the door, looking at Ethan with silent concern. Ethan helped the woman inside, her body shivering from cold and shock. He wasn't sure what he was doing or why, but something about her pulled at him. Maybe it was the vulnerability she radiated, or the way she seemed so utterly lost. "We'll take her back to the house," Ethan said, as Max closed the door behind him and returned to the driver's seat. The car pulled away from the curb, leaving the rain-soaked streets behind. The drive back to his estate was silent, except for the sound of the rain pelting the roof of the car. The woman sat beside him, curled into herself, her arms wrapped around her body as if trying to hold herself together. Ethan stole glances at her, wondering what could have happened to leave someone in such a state. Who was she? Why was she out there, alone, with no memory of herself? When they arrived at his sprawling estate, Ethan led her inside, the warmth of the house offering a stark contrast to the cold, wet night. The woman followed him obediently, like a lost child being led to safety. "Here," Ethan said softly, handing her a towel. "You can stay here tonight. We'll figure things out in the morning." She took the towel, her fingers trembling as she clutched it to her chest. Her eyes met his for the briefest moment, and Ethan saw something there. Fear, confusion, and maybe even a flicker of trust. "I don't even know my name," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Ethan felt a strange pang of sympathy. He had everything a person could ever want: money, power, influence. But in that moment, he realized how little any of it mattered when faced with such profound loss. This woman, whoever she was, had lost everything. Her identity, her past, her very sense of self. "It's okay," he said, his voice uncharacteristically gentle. "We'll figure this out. Together." As she disappeared into the guest room, Ethan stood in the hallway, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than met the eye. Something about her felt familiar. But that was impossible, wasn't it? He pushed the thought aside. For now, she was just a stranger in need of help. Tomorrow, they would start searching for answers. But tonight, Ethan Blake couldn't escape the gnawing feeling that her arrival wasn't just coincidence. Morning light filtered through the large windows of Ethan's mansion, casting a soft glow across the luxurious living room. Ethan sat at the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee, his eyes flickering occasionally toward the hallway where the guest room was. The woman, still without a name, had slept soundly, at least as far as he knew. She hadn't made a sound all night. He ran a hand through his dark hair, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled in his chest since he'd found her. Who was she? And why did he feel so drawn to her? Ethan wasn't someone easily swayed by emotion. Years in the ruthless real estate business had hardened him, but something about this woman made him feel responsible in a way he hadn't anticipated. Just then, the sound of soft footsteps echoed through the hallway. Ethan turned, and there she was, standing in the doorway of the kitchen, wearing one of his oversized sweaters that Max had left for her. She looked fragile but better, her hair still damp but brushed, and a glimmer of awareness in her eyes that hadn't been there the night before. "Morning," Ethan greeted, trying to sound casual, though his mind was filled with questions. "Morning," she replied softly, her voice a little stronger today. He gestured to the stool across from him. "I thought you might be hungry. Made some coffee, too." She moved cautiously, sitting down as if unsure of herself or the space she occupied. Her hands wrapped around the mug, her fingers warming against the ceramic, but she didn't drink right away. "Thank you," she said after a moment, her eyes not quite meeting his. "No need to thank me," Ethan replied, watching her closely. "You're safe here, but I think we need to talk about what happens next." She nodded slowly, as if considering his words. I don't even know where to begin. I can't remember anything. My name, where I'm from, nothing." Ethan leaned back in his chair, trying to approach this delicately. Sometimes memory loss can be temporary. It could come back in pieces, little by little. Maybe there are things we can do to help trigger it. I have connections, resources. I can hire someone to help figure out who you are. A flicker of panic crossed her face at the mention of her past. "What if I don't want to remember?" she whispered, the vulnerability in her voice cutting through Ethan like a knife. He hadn't expected that. Her words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Why wouldn't she want to remember her past? What could be so terrible that she'd rather stay lost than face it? "Is there something you're afraid of?" Ethan asked gently, leaning forward. "I don't know," she replied, her voice trembling. "It's just a feeling, like I've been running from something dark, but I can't remember what it is." Ethan studied her, his sharp instincts picking up on the fear behind her words. It was clear that whatever she was running from had left a deep scar, even if she couldn't remember the details. And yet, Ethan couldn't shake the suspicion that there was more to this than just a case of amnesia. Something felt off, like there was a piece of the puzzle missing. "I understand," Ethan said, offering her a reassuring look. "We'll take it slow. You don't have to face anything you're not ready for." She looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of deception. When she found none, she finally relaxed, her grip on the mug loosening. "Thank you," she whispered again, this time with a bit more sincerity. "For everything." Ethan gave her a small nod, though he still felt the weight of the unanswered questions between them. He wasn't used to feeling this uncertain about anything, least of all a stranger. But something about her vulnerability tugged at his guarded heart. As the day wore on, Ethan found himself increasingly distracted by her presence. He had business calls, meetings to attend to, but his mind kept drifting back to her. Every time he passed by the guest room, he wondered what she was doing, whether she was okay. Part of him wanted to help her regain her memory, but another part feared what they might uncover. That evening, as he wrapped up a video conference call, Ethan decided to check on her. He knocked softly on the door of the guest room, but got no response. Concerned, he opened the door a crack and peeked inside. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a bedside lamp casting long shadows across the walls. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at something in her hands. Ethan stepped inside, his curiosity piqued. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low. She looked up, startled, quickly tucking something under a pillow. Ethan caught a glimpse of paper. Was that a newspaper clipping? His chest tightened, but he didn't press her on it. He couldn't afford to spook her, not now. "Yeah," she replied quietly, though there was an edge to her voice. Just trying to make sense of things. Ethan nodded, though his mind was racing. What had she been hiding? Was it related to her past? He felt a surge of frustration. He had given her a place to stay, tried to help her, and yet she was clearly keeping something from him. But he held back, knowing that pushing her too hard might only drive her away. Instead, he offered her a small smile. "Take your time. You don't have to do this alone." She didn't respond, her eyes flickering back to the bed where she'd hidden the paper. Ethan lingered in the doorway for a moment longer, then turned to leave, his mind already plotting the next step. As he closed the door behind him, one thing was clear. There was more to this woman than just a lost memory. She was hiding something, and whatever it was, Ethan was determined to find out. The days passed slowly, with a strange tension building in the air between Ethan and the woman who still couldn't remember her name. They rarely spoke in depth about her past. Ethan had learned enough to sense that pushing too hard wouldn't lead to the answers they both needed. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken connection, something neither of them could ignore, and it left Ethan restless. Every morning, he found himself watching her, trying to figure out the puzzle she represented. She moved through his home with quiet grace, her eyes constantly scanning her surroundings, as if she was searching for something that could unlock the memories trapped in the corners of her mind. But it was clear that she hadn't yet pieced it all together. One evening, after a long day of dealing with his usual barrage of business meetings, Ethan came home to find her sitting by the large windows in the living room. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow over the room, making her look almost ethereal. She was staring out at the Seattle skyline, lost in thought. "Hey," Ethan greeted, his voice breaking the silence. She turned slowly, offering him a small smile, but her eyes were distant. "Hi. Everything okay?" he asked, sitting down across from her. She hesitated before answering, as if weighing how much she wanted to reveal. "It's overwhelming," she finally said. "Being here, not knowing who I am. I feel like a ghost." Ethan leaned forward, his brow furrowing. "You're not a ghost. You're here with me. We'll figure this out. I promise." Her eyes met his, and for a moment, something passed between them. A flicker of trust, maybe even understanding. But then, just as quickly, it was gone. She looked away, her fingers tracing the edge of the window frame. "There's something I've been meaning to ask," she said softly, not looking at him. Ethan felt his pulse quicken. He had been waiting for this. He knew the questions were coming, about his life, about the things she might have found during her time in his home. "What is it?" he asked carefully. She glanced at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "I found some articles," she admitted, "in one of the rooms upstairs. Old newspapers about you, about your daughter." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His daughter. It had been years since anyone had spoken about her, and he had done everything in his power to bury that part of his life. The pain of losing her had never really gone away, but he had learned to live with it. He had never expected this woman, this stranger in his home, to unearth those memories. "Why didn't you tell me about her?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Why didn't you tell me you had a daughter?" Ethan swallowed hard, his chest tightening. He had never spoken about his daughter to anyone, not even his closest business partners or friends. It was a wound he kept hidden, buried beneath layers of control and detachment. But now, faced with this woman, he couldn't hide anymore. She was taken from me," Ethan said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Years ago. It's not something I talk about." "I'm sorry," she whispered, her face softening. "I didn't mean to pry. I had to know. There's something about her, about your story, that feels familiar." Ethan's heart raced at her words. Familiar? How could his daughter's story feel familiar to her? She had no memory of her own life, and yet she was saying that his past, his deepest pain, somehow resonated with her. "What do you mean, familiar?" Ethan asked, his voice edged with urgency. "I don't know," she admitted, her hands trembling in her lap. "It's just, when I saw those articles, something stirred in me. I feel like I'm connected to this somehow. Like your daughter's story might be part of my own." Ethan stared at her, his mind spinning. Was it possible? Could there be a connection between this woman and the tragedy that had defined his life for so long? No, he said, shaking his head. That's not possible. You couldn't have anything to do with that. My daughter's been gone for years. I know, she said quickly. I know it doesn't make sense, but it's just this feeling, Ethan. This overwhelming feeling that there's something more. Something I can't remember. Ethan stood, pacing the room, his mind racing with conflicting thoughts. He wanted to believe her, but how could he? His daughter's disappearance had been a mystery, one that had nearly destroyed him. And now, this woman, this stranger, was telling him that she felt connected to it? What are you saying? Ethan asked, turning to face her. Do you think you knew her? My daughter? I don't know, she admitted, standing as well. But I think I need to find out. Ethan stared at her, his mind reeling. If she was right, if there was even the slightest chance that she knew something about his daughter's disappearance, then everything could change. His entire life could change. How? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How would you know her? Where would you have met her? She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. I don't know, Ethan, but I think I've been looking for her. Even before I lost my memory, I think I was trying to find her. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. The idea was impossible, yet it felt like a key turning in a long-locked door. Could this woman, the one who had wandered into his life by accident, hold the answers he had been searching for all these years? You think you're connected to my daughter's disappearance? Ethan asked, his voice laced with disbelief. She nodded, her hands trembling at her sides. I don't know how, but yes, I think I am. Ethan felt a wave of emotion crash over him. Hope, fear, disbelief. It was too much to process, too much to take in all at once. But one thing was clear. This woman wasn't just a stranger. She was tied to his past in ways neither of them could yet understand. And now, they would have to uncover the truth together, no matter how painful it might be. The air in the room felt heavy, as though the weight of the revelations they were tiptoeing around had sucked out all the oxygen. Ethan could hardly believe what he was hearing. This woman, who just days ago had no memory of her own life, was now standing in his living room, telling him she might be connected to his daughter's disappearance. It was absurd, impossible even. And yet, something about the way she said it, the urgency in her voice, planted a seed of doubt in Ethan's mind. They stood facing each other, the tension between them palpable. The silence stretched on as Ethan struggled to process the implications of what she was saying. Do you remember anything specific? Ethan finally asked, his voice hoarse, barely masking the anxiety boiling inside him. Anything at all? A place, a name, something that connects you to my daughter? She shook her head, visibly frustrated. No, I can't remember details, but I know there's something. I don't know why, but I feel it. When I look at you, at this house, at the things I've seen in your office, it's like pieces of a puzzle I can't put together. Ethan paced the room, his thoughts spiraling. He had spent years trying to move on, telling himself that his daughter was gone forever, that searching for her would only lead to more pain. But now this woman, this stranger, was standing here, offering a sliver of hope. Hope he didn't dare cling to, yet couldn't entirely dismiss. I'm not sure what to think, Ethan admitted, stopping in his tracks and turning to face her again. This doesn't make sense. My daughter disappeared when she was just a child. How could you be involved? I don't know, she whispered, her hands wringing together. But I've seen her face before. I know I have. Ethan's chest tightened. That image, the face of his daughter, had haunted him for years. It had been so long since anyone had spoken about her, and now, hearing this woman say those words brought back the pain he had fought so hard to bury. You've seen her? His voice was low, but there was an edge of desperation there now. How? Where? I don't remember, she said, tears filling her eyes as she pressed her hands to her temples. I keep trying to remember, but it's like every time I get close, it slips away again. Ethan could feel his pulse racing. He didn't want to get his hopes up, but something inside him was awakening, something he had tried to suffocate for years, a need for answers. He couldn't ignore it anymore. Tell me everything you do remember, Ethan said, his tone more forceful now, driven by his need for the truth. Start from the beginning. She took a deep breath, clearly trying to calm herself as she searched for any shred of memory that might help. I remember waking up in a strange place, she began, her voice shaky but determined. It wasn't here, but it felt like a hospital. I don't know how long I was there, but I remember feeling disoriented, confused. There were people talking around me, but I couldn't understand what they were saying. It was all muffled, like I was underwater. And then, I escaped. Escaped? Ethan's brow furrowed. From where? I don't know, she said, her frustration mounting again. It's all blurry. I just know I had to leave. I had to find something, or someone, and then I was wandering the streets. That's when you found me. Ethan ran a hand over his face, trying to make sense of it all. Nothing about this sounded familiar to him, and yet, something deep inside told him there was truth in her story. She wasn't making this up. You think you were looking for my daughter, Ethan said, half to himself. She nodded, wiping away a tear that had escaped down her cheek. Yes, I don't know how I know, but I'm sure of it. I was looking for her. Ethan felt a cold dread creeping up his spine. This was all too much, too fast. But if there was even a chance she knew something, anything, about his daughter, he had to follow the thread, no matter where it led. There's something I need to show you, Ethan said suddenly, his decision made. He turned on his heel and walked out of the living room, heading toward the hallway. She followed him in silence, her footsteps barely audible on the hardwood floor. They made their way to the far end of the house, to a room Ethan hadn't opened in years. His hand hovered over the doorknob, the memories rushing back all at once. Memories of his daughter running through the halls, her laughter echoing through the house. He had locked this part of his life away, and now he was about to confront it once again. Ethan pushed the door open, revealing a room that had been untouched since the day his daughter had disappeared. It was a small room, filled with soft pink hues, stuffed animals, and toys. Everything a little girl would have loved. Her room. She stepped inside hesitantly, her eyes scanning the space. Ethan watched her closely, waiting for some kind of reaction, some sign that this room sparked something in her. For a long moment, she just stood there, silent, taking it all in. Then, slowly, she walked over to the small bookshelf in the corner. Her fingers brushed over the spines of the books, her eyes distant, as if trying to connect to something just out of reach. I've been here before, she whispered, her voice so soft Ethan almost didn't hear her. His heart lurched. What did you say? She turned to face him, her eyes wide with realization. I've been here before, Ethan. I remember this room. Ethan felt his knees weaken as the words sank in. His head spun as he tried to process what she was saying. If she had been in this room before, it meant she wasn't just some random woman with amnesia. It meant she had been a part of his life, his daughter's life. What are you saying? Ethan asked, his voice trembling. How do you know this room? I don't know, she said, her voice shaking. But I do. I've been here. I remember her. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the reality of her words hit him. This woman, this stranger who had stumbled into his life, wasn't just connected to his past. She had lived it. The question that haunted him now was, how? And why had she come back? Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he stood frozen in the doorway of his daughter's room. The air felt thick with the weight of years of buried memories and unsolved mysteries. He stared at her, this woman who claimed to know his daughter's room, to have been there before, and 1,000 thoughts rushed through his mind. Was she telling the truth? Was this some sort of cruel twist of fate? She stood in the center of the room, her fingers still trailing over the spines of the books, her eyes filled with uncertainty. But beneath that, Ethan could see something else, recognition. She wasn't lying. She knew this room. I don't understand, Ethan said, stepping farther into the room, his voice tight with confusion and a hint of fear. How could you have been here? How could you know any of this? She turned slowly to face him, her hands trembling as she clasped them together in front of her. I don't know, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. But I do. I remember it. The colors, the toys, the smell. It's all so familiar. Ethan's eyes flicked to the small bed in the corner, still neatly made with the pink comforter his daughter had loved. He hadn't changed anything in this room since she had disappeared. It was as if time had stopped here, the room frozen in the past while the rest of the world moved on. And now, the past seemed to be catching up to him in a way he had never expected. "There's no way," Ethan said, shaking his head as if trying to make sense of the impossible. "My daughter's been gone for years. How could you possibly be connected to her? You didn't even know your own name when I found you." She took a deep breath, her eyes wide with fear, but also with a growing sense of determination. "Ethan, I think I've been running from something. From this. I've been trying to remember, but it's like every time I get close, something pulls me back. I don't know why I was in that hospital or how I ended up on the street that night, but I do know that your daughter, she's the key. She's why I'm here." Ethan's mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. His daughter had vanished without a trace years ago, and there had been no leads, no answers. He had given up hope of ever finding out what happened. But now, standing in his daughter's room, with this woman who seemed inexplicably tied to her, Ethan felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in years, the possibility of truth. He took a step closer, his voice low, almost afraid of the words he was about to say. Do you think you knew her? Knew my daughter?" She hesitated for a moment, her brow furrowing as she searched her fractured memories. "I think so," she said quietly, "but it's not clear. It's like flashes, pieces of a dream that I can't quite hold on to. I see her face. I hear her laugh, but then it slips away again." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as the image of his daughter filled his mind. Her laughter, her smile, those were the memories he had held onto for so long, the only things that had kept him going after she disappeared. And now, to hear this woman, this stranger, speak of those same memories, it was almost too much to bear. "I need answers," Ethan said, his voice tight with emotion. "I can't keep living like this with all these questions, all this uncertainty. If you know something, anything, I need you to tell me. I need to know what happened to her." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want to help you," she whispered, "but I don't know how. I'm trying to remember, but it's like something is blocking me." Ethan stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers. "What do you mean, blocking you? Do you think someone's trying to keep you from remembering?" "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking, "but it feels like every time I get close to the truth, something pushes it back. I feel like I'm missing something important, something that could change everything." Ethan felt a wave of frustration wash over him. He had spent so many years searching for answers, and now, when he was finally on the brink of discovering the truth, it still felt just out of reach. "There has to be something," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Some clue, something we've overlooked." She looked around the room again, her eyes scanning the toys, the books, the small paintings on the walls. Suddenly, she froze. Her gaze locked onto something near the bed, something small and nearly hidden under a pile of stuffed animals. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice rising with anticipation. She crossed the room quickly, her hands trembling as she reached down and pulled out a small, worn-out stuffed bear. Its fur was matted from years of wear, one of its eyes missing, and the stitching along its belly was coming undone. She stared at it for a long moment, her breath hitching in her throat. "This bear," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've seen it before. I know this bear." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "That was my daughter's favorite toy," he said quietly. "She never went anywhere without it." Tears filled her eyes as she clutched the bear to her chest. "I remember it," she said, her voice cracking. "I held it. I was with her. I don't know when or how, but I was with your daughter." Ethan's mind raced. This woman wasn't just some stranger who had wandered into his life by accident. She had been with his daughter. She knew her. "You were with her?" Ethan asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You were with my daughter before she disappeared?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face now. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I think I was the last person who saw her." Ethan's world tilted as the enormity of her words sank in. She had been with his daughter. She might be the key to everything. And yet, there were still so many questions, so many pieces of the puzzle missing. What happened to her? Ethan asked, his voice raw with emotion. Where is she? I don't know, she said, shaking her head, the tears falling faster now. I can't remember, but I know I was there. I know I was with her. Ethan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was so close to the answers he had been seeking for years, but they were still just out of reach. We'll figure this out, Ethan said, his voice fierce with determination. I don't care how long it takes. We'll find the truth. Together. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear, with uncertainty, but also with something else, hope. I'm scared, she whispered. What if the truth is worse than we think? Ethan's jaw tightened. Whatever the truth is, he said, we'll face it. I won't stop until I find her. The room fell silent again, the weight of their shared determination filling the space between them. They were standing on the edge of something huge, something that could change everything. And neither of them was ready to turn back now. The house was eerily quiet after their emotional revelation. Ethan paced the hallway, his mind a whirlpool of thoughts, his heart pounding as if it might break through his chest. He had waited years for any sign of his daughter, any clue to what had happened that fateful day. Now, standing at the edge of a discovery that could either heal or destroy him, he felt a mixture of fear and hope, battling for control. The woman, still clutching the worn bear to her chest, sat on the edge of the bed, her eyes vacant as she struggled to reconcile the shattered fragments of her memory. She was fighting to put the pieces together, but there was a wall blocking her, something deep and buried that refused to resurface. Ethan stopped pacing and turned toward her. He couldn't just stand by and wait for the memories to come flooding back. He had to do something. He had to know more. There has to be something we're missing, Ethan said, his voice resolute. You remember holding the bear. You remember being with her. But where were you? Why were you with her? She shook her head, her fingers gripping the stuffed toy tighter, her face a mixture of frustration and anguish. I don't know, she whispered, her voice strained. It's like every time I try to go deeper, there's this fog, and it pulls me back. Ethan took a step closer, kneeling in front of her. He spoke gently but with urgency, trying to break through whatever barrier was holding her back. You're not alone in this. We'll figure it out together. I don't care how hard it is or what we find. I just need you to try. You were with her. You might be the only one who can help me bring her back. She looked down at him, her tear-filled eyes searching his, and nodded, though it was clear how hard this was for her. Slowly, she closed her eyes, as if willing herself to dive deeper into the darkness of her mind. I see. A park, she murmured after a long moment, her voice trembling as the memory surfaced. There were children, and a playground. It was bright outside, warm. I was with her. We were sitting on a bench. Ethan's breath hitched. A park. That was where his daughter had been the last day he saw her. She had been playing at the park with her nanny, and then she was gone. What else do you see? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. She frowned, her hands shaking as she clutched the bear tighter. I was watching her. She was laughing, playing in the sand, and then her breath quickened, her face twisting with fear. There was a man. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. A man. His heart raced as a dark possibility took root in his mind. What man? Did you know him? I don't know, she said, her voice growing more frantic. But he was there, standing near the playground. I don't think anyone else saw him. He was watching us. Ethan's chest tightened, his mind flashing back to all the dead ends and failed leads over the years. The police had found no sign of foul play, no suspicious witnesses. But if there had been a man there, if this was real, it meant someone had taken his daughter. What did he look like? Ethan pressed, his voice thick with tension. Can you remember anything about him? She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks as she fought to hold on to the fragile memory. I can't see his face. It's like it's just out of reach. But I remember the way he moved. He was calm, deliberate. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to suppress the rising panic inside him. He needed more than this. He needed something concrete, something that would bring him closer to finding his daughter. "You said you were with her," Ethan said, his voice lowering as a new thought crossed his mind. "Were you watching her? Like a babysitter?" She shook her head slowly, her brow furrowing in confusion. "No, not a babysitter. I don't think so. It was more than that. I felt responsible for her, protective, like I needed to keep her safe." The weight of her words hung between them. Ethan felt a surge of something: hope, fear, uncertainty. Could this woman have been more than just a stranger in his daughter's life? Could she have played a crucial role in whatever had happened that day? "I need you to think harder," Ethan said, his voice quiet but firm. "Why were you with her? What's your connection to my daughter?" She closed her eyes again, her hands trembling as she clung to the stuffed bear, trying to pull the answers from the fog of her memory. Minutes passed in silence, and Ethan held his breath, waiting for something. Anything that could give him the answers he had been seeking for so long. And then, her eyes snapped open, wide and filled with shock. "Oh my God," she gasped, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't just with her. I was taking her." Ethan's blood ran cold. The room seemed to spin as the weight of her words crashed over him. He stumbled back, his mind reeling. You took her?" he stammered, his voice filled with disbelief and rising horror. "I don't know why," she cried, her hands flying to her mouth as the tears flowed freely now. "I didn't mean to. I didn't want to hurt her. But I remember now. I took her away from the park. She trusted me. And I walked away with her." Ethan's heart pounded in his ears, the room closing in around him. This woman he had saved from the street, brought into his home, had been the one to take his daughter? The rage, the grief, the sheer weight of the revelation was almost too much to bear. "Why?" Ethan demanded, his voice cracking as he struggled to hold himself together. "Why would you take her? Where did you take her?" She shook her head violently, her face twisted in anguish. "I don't know. I don't remember. It's all a blur after that. I see her face, I hear her voice, but I don't know what happened next." Ethan felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. The one person who had brought him closer to the truth was also the one who had taken his daughter away. "I trusted you," Ethan said, his voice shaking. "I brought you into my home." "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her voice breaking with guilt and regret. "I'm so sorry, Ethan. I didn't mean to. I didn't know." Ethan stood there, his hands trembling as the weight of everything pressed down on him. He had spent years chasing shadows, searching for answers. And now, the person who held the key to his daughter's disappearance was standing in front of him, just as lost and broken as he was. But there was still one question that burned in his mind. One question that he needed an answer to, no matter how painful it might be. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Where is my daughter now?" The woman shook her head, her sobs racking her body. "I don't know. I wish I knew. But we can still find her, Ethan. I know we can." Ethan stared at her, torn between his need for the truth and the overwhelming betrayal he felt. Could he trust her? Could she really help him find his daughter after all these years? Only one thing was certain now. The past he had tried so hard to bury was finally catching up to him. And whether he was ready or not, the truth was coming. Ethan stared at her, the words hanging in the air like a weight that pressed down on his chest. She took her. The woman standing before him, who had been nothing but a mystery since the day he found her, was the last person to see his daughter. Rage, betrayal, and confusion warred inside him, but even those emotions couldn't overshadow the need for answers. "You took her," Ethan said again, almost to himself, trying to make sense of it. "But why? What were you going to do with her?" Sarah, if that was even her real name, collapsed into the nearest chair, her face pale and tear-streaked. "I don't know. I can't remember everything. I just remember her trust in me, and then the fear of what I was doing." Ethan couldn't suppress the anger boiling up inside him. "You had her. You could have told me from the beginning. Instead, you let me believe you were a victim." "I am a victim," she snapped back, surprising even herself with the sharpness of her voice. I don't know what happened to me, Ethan. I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. Ethan fell silent, his jaw tight as he wrestled with what to do next. There was no going back now. He was too close to the truth. But before he could say anything, Sarah spoke again, her voice quieter now. There's something else, she said, her eyes downcast. Something I haven't told you. Ethan tensed, dread creeping into his chest. What is it? I wasn't alone, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The man you saw, the one near the playground. He was the one who told me to take her. Ethan's heart stopped. Who? He demanded, his voice sharp with urgency. Who was it? I don't know, she said, her tears flowing again. I can't remember his face, but he was there, watching, waiting. He told me what to do, and I listened. I think he had control over me somehow. Ethan's mind raced. Control? Someone else had orchestrated the abduction of his daughter, and Sarah had been the puppet. But who? And why? Desperate for answers, Ethan grabbed his phone and began dialing an old contact from his past, the private investigator he'd hired years ago to track down any lead on his daughter. The investigation had gone cold, but now there was new information. Maybe this mysterious man could be traced. Sarah watched him from across the room, her body tense as she hugged herself, guilt and fear etched across her face. Ethan didn't speak to her again as he made the call, his focus laser-sharp on finding out who had taken his daughter. The investigator, Tom, picked up on the third ring. Ethan explained everything. Sarah's fragmented memories, the unknown man, the park, and Tom's silence on the other end of the line spoke volumes. I'll dig into it, Tom said finally, his voice steady. There are underground rings, human trafficking, illegal adoptions. This could be connected to something bigger. Let me run a few things and get back to you. Ethan hung up, the weight of uncertainty pressing on him again. The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. Sarah sat across from him, her eyes red and swollen from crying, her hands gripping the stuffed bear as if it were her lifeline. I'm sorry, she said, her voice raw with emotion. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't even know who I was. Ethan's anger softened slightly. He still didn't trust her completely, but he could see the genuine regret in her eyes. She was as much a victim as his daughter, tangled in something far darker than either of them had anticipated. We'll find her, Ethan said, though the words sounded hollow, even to him. He wasn't sure if he was trying to comfort her or himself. A few days passed in tense silence as they waited for Tom to return with information. Each day felt like a lifetime, filled with anxious anticipation and a growing sense of dread. Ethan tried to focus on work, but every time he closed his eyes, all he saw was his daughter, her laughter, her smile, and the aching void her absence had left in his heart. Then, late one evening, Ethan's phone rang. It was Tom. I found something, Tom said without preamble. There's a man, James Donovan. He's connected to a series of child abductions across the country. He works in the shadows, targeting vulnerable families and using people like Sarah to do his dirty work. I think he's our guy. Ethan felt his blood turn to ice. James Donovan. The name didn't mean anything to him, but the fact that this man had been responsible for other abductions made his stomach churn. Where is he? Ethan asked, his voice deadly calm. I tracked him to a private estate outside of the city. It's heavily guarded, but I think it's where he's been keeping the children. Ethan's hands clenched into fists. His daughter might still be alive, and now he had a name, a place. He wasn't going to wait any longer. I'm going there, Ethan said, already heading for the door. Tom's voice was firm. Don't do anything reckless, Ethan. I'll send backup. This guy is dangerous. But Ethan wasn't listening. The only thing on his mind was getting his daughter back. After years of searching, he was closer than ever, and nothing was going to stop him now. The drive to Donovan's estate felt like a blur, adrenaline pumping through Ethan's veins as he sped down the highway. Sarah sat beside him, silent and pale, her hands trembling in her lap. She had insisted on coming with him, though Ethan wasn't sure if he trusted her to face what was coming. Still, she was the only link he had to his daughter, and he needed her. They arrived just before dawn, the estate looming in the distance like a fortress. Ethan's heart raced as he scanned the grounds, trying to figure out the best way in. He could see guards patrolling the perimeter, their shadows long in the early morning light. "We can't just walk in," Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. "They'll kill us." Ethan's jaw tightened. "We're not walking in. We're taking back what's mine." With Tom's help, they had a plan. The investigator had called in favors, and soon enough, an unmarked van arrived, carrying armed men ready to storm the estate. Ethan had no intention of sitting on the sidelines. He was going in. The operation unfolded with brutal efficiency. Ethan and the team stormed the compound, taking down guards and searching every room for the children. Every second felt like an eternity, each empty room only heightening his desperation. Then, in the farthest room, he saw her. His daughter. She was older now, her face pale and thin, but there was no mistaking her. The moment their eyes met, something broke inside Ethan. She stood frozen for a heartbeat, then ran into his arms, tears streaming down her face. "Daddy," she sobbed. "I knew you'd come." Ethan held her tight, his own tears falling as years of grief and pain melted away. He had found her. After all the years of searching, she was alive.